Good.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing this for me with me. I'm very excited to speak with you. I don't know if you don't know if you remember me, but I went to school with Duncan, Luke, and Brinton,
Oh, really? Okay.
and I
Okay.
was my sister was in Luke's class. Heather Pevlin, her name was.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I was good friends with Ken Anderson, your neighbor. So
All right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Ken's
so
in Calgary now. Yeah.
he is. Yeah, I saw him there recently. But
Yeah.
yeah, so it's great to talk to you.
Oh, good.
Um, I I guess I'd like to begin with I guess the most obvious topic and the whole COVID-19 thing. And so
Mhm.
I'm wondering how are you responding to this whole isolation? Is it affecting your work at all? Is it change anything you do in your
Uh,
own day?
I'm not as affected, I think, as some people. I mean, a life as a writer is fairly solitary anyway. I just miss seeing other people, friends, and family. That's really the main thing. My day basically, other than that, hasn't changed all that much. I mean, I get up early in the morning, I write for a while, go out for a walk. I just now have to keep my distance. And in the evening, probably FaceTime with some family and friends, and that's kind of it. Um, so life is not all that much different. I think after a time, the access to other people will start to become more of a distracting factor.
Yeah, for sure. So you normally work from home on a normal.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I always have work from home. I have an office and I have access to another room that I use a lot. So yeah, so it's basically myself, my wife, and our dog.
Yeah. Yeah, so if that's the case, do you have any, I suppose, any advice for maybe emerging writers or other people in any creative art really to kind of how to deal with this, who maybe people who aren't used to staying at home and how they can
Yeah,
maybe structure
yeah.
their day or get some kind of
Well,
work?
I think a key thing would be to set a schedule for yourself and try to be disciplined enough to keep to that. If discover when your best time for writing is. For me, it's the morning. I'm kind of useless in the evening. I'm just too distracted or too tired by that time. So I've over the years I've discovered by getting up early, and by early I mean like 5:30. I love that time because there's nobody else in the house awake, and there's no extraneous noise, and there's nothing else going on. And I especially like when it's dark, and so it's only me and the computer screen. So I guess that would be the advice is to find that time, and now which you probably have more choice than you ever had before, and try to stick to that and isolate yourself as much as you can. I sometimes envy other creative artists like painters who can paint to music, or potters who have rock music in the background. But for me, none of that works. It has to be silence.
I'm the same way. And some of my writer friends, yeah, they write to like, rock music and music
Mm,
with all these lyrics. I don't
mm,
understand how they can
yeah.
focus on their own words, but yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned you mostly write on a computer, do you? Has that changed over the years? Did you always
Well,
write
originally,
on a computer?
so my writing goes back quite a number of years, of course.
Yeah,
So originally, I was writing longhand.
yeah,
Initially not long writing longhand, and then typewriter. But once computers came along, and from the very beginning, I moved over to computers. It just makes it that much easier, especially for revising and changing things up. Um, so I got used to it fairly quickly, and I like that. There are writers who still like to be able to just write longhand to begin with, and then maybe transfer over. But I pretty well start on the computer and continue on it.
yeah. And yeah, I guess speaking about your early days, I know I think it was your first book, Holdfast. That won the
Right.
Governor's General. That was your very first book, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. How did that how did that affect like your writing career? Like, did it give you more confidence? Did it maybe make you
uh,
more insecure about your second book, third book?
yeah, yeah. Well, it definitely gave me more confidence. And you mentioned the second book. Yeah, there was probably a bit of pressure. I had the advantage. I wasn't living in St. John's at the time. I was living in rural Newfoundland,
Mm.
in and around Eastport. and it's generally a few friends, to small communities, so you don't have the big distractions you might otherwise of a say an ongoing writing community. So it wasn't. I can't say it was a major uh, distraction for me. I knew that the second book probably would be looked at in a different light, considering the first one had, excuse me, won the Governor General's Award. So I was somewhat conscious of that. But because the book had gained a lot of attention, not just the Governor General's Award. There were actually a couple of other awards that it won in the same year. So there was this kind of a buildup of expectations, I suppose. But I felt being in rural Newfoundland was somewhat removed from, a major writing scene. So I
Yeah.
just stuck with it. Yeah.
Um,
And
and if I'm,
as well, it was the first book. You didn't make a huge amount of money from it. So it was not as if suddenly I was independently wealthy. I was
yeah.
I had been a teacher full time, so I continued to substitute teach and write in my spare time. So that continued on for a number of years. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not sure if you ever heard him speak about this, but I know Joel Thomas Hynes, for example, he recently, when he won the Governor General, I believe it was last year or 2 years ago, he
Mm.
actually cited Holdfast as one of his major influences. And I mean, you wrote that book over 40 years ago, I think.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what's
Published
it like? How does it feel to have a book that is still influencing, major writers in Canada over
yeah,
40 years
yeah.
later?
Yeah, Joel has said to me personally how much the book meant to him, which I, considering the strength of Joel as a writer, I'm um, really pleased with. And another kind of offshoot story of that, I used to do a fair amount of reading in schools and so on. And once I went to Labrador City, and I didn't know at the time, but who should be in the classroom and hear me but Michael Crumming.
Oh, yeah.
So I'd like to think maybe I was a wee influence on him as well. So yeah, it's been a long career up to this point, and it's moved around different directions. Holdfast was considered a kind of a young adult novel, although it had a wide adult appeal as well. But I've gone from that into solely adult books, really. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny it's classified as YA because I mean, I read it back when I was in, I can't remember what grade, 7 or 8 or something. And I
Mm.
read it again as an adult, and I appreciate it way more as an
Oh,
adult.
did you?
So
Yeah. Okay.
it's
Well,
funny that it was classified as YA. But
yeah.
yeah, I've always marveled about like your work that you've crossed all these genres. You write YA, you write fiction, historical fiction, nonfiction. You have that
Children's books.
encyclopedia. How do you begin crossing all these genres, especially like when they're ongoing at the same time? Is that a challenge for you? Or
Yeah.
any insight about that?
Well, I kind of like each book to be a challenge, and sometimes the opportunity arises. Like I wrote a history of Newfoundland and Labrador as near to heaven by sea. I'd never
Yeah.
in a million years intended to write a history, but I was approached by the publisher, um, Penguin, to consider it. And I hesitated for a long time, but eventually it became too much of a challenge to resist.
Mm.
So yeah, I kind of look at the genre and see what I can do within that. Like I've just recently moved into writing mysteries.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a very different genre again. And I said, well, I'll try it once and see how it works out. And what I wrote was a kind of a bit offbeat. It was not perhaps your typical murder mystery. It had a fair amount of humor to it. So, but people seem to like it, and so I'm just submitted the manuscript actually for a sequel to it, and which I've never done before. That's kind of interesting. I've never written a sequel to any of the other books, and even though I've been asked to by publishers from time to time.
Yeah, so that's actually something I was going to ask because I recently read One for the Rock, I assume is what you're speaking about, the mystery.
Yeah, yeah.
So you didn't set out with a sequel in mind. That was never the initial plan.
No, although when I was writing it, I thought this could lend itself to a sequel. I think I think I had in mind, if the book was reasonably successful, that I would attempt a sequel.
Mm,
And of course, the main character is a tour guide.
mm,
So my idea initially, as I was working my way through, oh, well, you need not be touring just in St. John's. You can travel to different parts of Newfoundland and Labrador, and you can set stories potentially throughout this province if that was what I was inclined to do. So in fact, the second book, which is called tentatively, the working title is called Two for the Tablelands. So, it's set partly in Grossmore National Park. Yeah.
right. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you, in your real life, you've given tours to Beaumont Hamel. Is that so? You were a tour guide at
I
one
had
point?
done that in the past. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite a number of years ago now. Yeah.
So what, I guess for this book specifically and your work in general, how much does your personal experience, whether personal or professional,
Yeah.
play into your character and your plots? Do you ever draw upon the
Somewhat,
dynamics?
yeah. I have done other tours as well, actually, small 3-day tours in and around St. John's for a group called Adventure Canada.
Mm,
So these are on-land tours concentrating on St. John's and the kind of artistic aspects of it. um, and so some of that, because we did go to restaurants, all that kind of thing, which takes place in the book, and we did some of the hikes. We gone to some of the specific sites and so on. So I felt like I could draw upon that. Now, the characters, the 6 people in the tour group, are fictitious.
yeah,
But
I
you
should
can,
hope so. I read the book, so.
you can have a lot of fun. You can have a lot of fun with it. So, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And another thing I noticed about reading this book, and especially when I think back to Holdfast, less so in One for the Rock, but the role that vernacular plays in your work, and I think that's probably what Joel Thomas Hynes was so influenced by you, was your use of vernacular. What do you think? What is it about the way we speak here? And I know you spoke of Michael Crummey; he draws upon that a
Mhm.
lot,
Yeah,
and I think a lot of writers in Newfoundland draw upon. Mary Dalton.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
um, Writers of all stripes.
yeah.
What is it about the way we speak that you're so drawn to, do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's such an integral part of who we are. I think, both in rural as well as urban Newfoundland. I mean, you have a certain use of language in St. John's that is very different from what I knew in Bonavista Bay, for example.
Mm,
Um, but living among the people in, say, Bonavista Bay and teaching school, I came in contact with it continuously. And so if I was going to create characters set in these places, and it seemed to me quite natural. And, there's a beauty to some of the words and some of the way of phrasing that people use that I don't always say it's lilting, but it's kind of a free flow of language and the way it's used. That's special to this place. And I think using it creates the atmosphere of the place. So it's not only the landscape, it's a kind of verbal landscape as well that will create the feel for a place. So um, you had to be somewhat careful, I suppose. From the very beginning, even with Holdfast, I didn't really want to write in a fashion using words and phrases, and there were lots of them that I could have used, that wasn't able to be deciphered from the context. You know, I think you can read Holdfast and not have ever been to Newfoundland and still understand what's going on. But I didn't want the people to have the dictionary of Newfoundland English next to them in order to understand this book. So you kind of reach a middle ground in the use of language and the use of dialect, certainly. Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, speaking of the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, was that a major influence for you? It's been a major influence for me as a writer. Do you,
Yeah, yeah, that was,
how
it's
much
been
is
a kind of a constant book on my desk since it came out. So, and it
yeah.
came out, prior to when I started writing. Yeah.
Yeah, did it? Well, I thought that came out in the 80s. Maybe I'm wrong. 70s did it come out?
I think I think there was an early version of it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
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 Um, yeah, and one very specific question I had about the book, about One for the Rock specifically. Um, the dog's name is Gaffer.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was a very clever allusion to the actual definition of Gaffer, which is, I believe it's something to do with like a young boy or girl who is helpful to older people. And it's
Yeah.
funny because the dog is actually very pivotal in the protagonist's success in
Sure.
that book. Was
Yeah.
that an intentional kind of play on that word? Is that how much you looked
Well,
into these
actually,
words?
Gaffer is the real dog. It's I based him on our own dog, who
Oh,
is
really?
who is the same breed, has the same name, has some of the same attributes. In fact, he's right here looking at me through the door. So yeah, the name Gaffer was picked. He was obviously picked years ago when we first got him, but it was a word my father often used. You young Gaffer, referring to, of course, a often young fellow helping his family out of the fishery and so on. So it was a name that seemed to work for me as a name for a dog and for my wife as well. So yeah.
Mm, yeah. And so when you were writing this book, well, what struck me is that, so yeah, you wrote One for the Rock, and then you have a sequel coming out this year. But in between those two books, you wrote
Mm,
another completely different book
yeah,
about
yeah,
totally different characters,
yeah.
totally different situation. Yeah. Also with Breakwater, I believe that came out.
Yeah, yeah.
Is it difficult for you to, like, in between a series to go, like, how do you keep the character straight and the
Mm,
voices, and is
yeah.
that a challenge for you, or how did you?
Well, Land Beyond the Sea has a long history, actually. It's the third part of a trilogy of Newfoundland historical novels. So the writing of it had been done over perhaps 8 years of, the research and writing. So I had started that long before I had done One for the Rock.
I see.
So it just came to a finishing point in between, kind of after One for the Rock, and so that its publication was, as I said, the culmination of several years' work. Because if you know the book, it had to be heavily researched in order to, especially the German aspect of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you even begin? Yeah, I mean, it's easy, well, not easy enough, but it's easier to write from a Newfoundland perspective. But how would you research like what a German would have went through during World War
Yeah,
II? Like,
yeah.
how do you even approach that?
Well, that was the biggest challenge for the book, because I really, and for those people who don't know what the story is about, it's centered around the sinking of the Nova Scotia to Newfoundland ferry, the Caribou, during the Second World War, by German U-boat 69. So I knew some things about it. We knew who the captain was, and I really wanted to start to tell some of the story from his perspective, because I knew full well there's two sides to war, and I wanted people to see not only the side that we know best here in Newfoundland, which is the Allied side, and the people, the taverners and so on, and all the crew that lost their lives in that tragedy. But what intrigued me, what was this German captain thinking? Did he feel this was a legitimate target? Because there was a lot of controversy saying that this is a civilian vessel, so Germans shouldn't be, going after it. So that set up the scenario where I had to start doing a lot of research, and basically it came from two areas. Um, uh, I don't want to give away too much, but Grafe didn't survive the war. So there was nothing, he had not written anything afterwards, as some U-boat captains had done who did survive the war. That was really the starting point. There were a number of biographies and autobiographies of German U-boat captains. And so from those, I got a sense of what they went through, what their training was, how they viewed the war, how they for the most part, separated them from the whole Nazi regime in a way. They were first and foremost seamen, and they were eventually caught up in the war, but they had real pride. They were often the top-notch students of the time period. I mean, they're all well-educated and very smart individuals. Mm-hmm. So there was that, and then I went as well to the German U-boat archives in Germany, which is quite extensive, and their military archives. So I was able, for example, to get a copy of the log that was kept by U-69, by Grafe, by the captain on that particular patrol. So I could see what happened before and where he was up to the point of obviously the torpedoing, and then what happened subsequently, him going back to port in France and so on. It was in German, of course, but I had somebody translate it for me. And there was that. There were some, I could trace his early training, his military training. I could tell where he went for training, and then I could read up on that particular academy, for example, and see how the German seamen were trained. What I didn't know, and I finally had to give up looking for it any further, was, for example, did he have any siblings? Did he have any brothers and sisters? I couldn't really find that out. I did find out the name of his mother and father, and the fact that his father was a doctor, although as it turns out wasn't a medical doctor. He was a lawyer. The term doctor is used differently in Germany. So I had somebody pursue that. A friend of mine who's German went to or contacted the Records Bureau in Dresden, where Grafe had grown up. I wasn't sure even if the record still existed, because, of course, Dresden was bombed so heavily at the end of the war. But even if they were able to be found, they would not be released to anybody but family members. Mm. So finally, in the end, I made him, I guess, an only child, which probably doesn't distract any from the book. It would have been nice to know. And had I known, for example, if he had a sister, I might have used that at some point in the story. Yeah.
Oh, is that Gaffer in the background?
Yeah. He just came in from his walk. He probably sees the dog out through the front window.
Yeah, that's fascinating about the research. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people don't realize what kind of in-depth research goes into.
Yeah. Well, I spent just as much time researching as I did the writing of the book.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah, because I read a lot about the construction of U-boats. I really had to know how they were set up. So when I had characters moving inside them, where were they going from what compartment to what compartment? I went to Chicago. Chicago's Museum of Industry and Technology has one, I think, of only 2 intact U-boats from the First World War, or from the Second World War. So they have it there on permanent display, so you can do tours of it. And I did an extensive tour of that. So that was another component to add to it. Mm.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, so what do you think the ratio would be between, like, how much time do you spend researching and how fast, not how fast, but how much time do you spend writing?
It depends, of course, on the book. With One for the Rock, I basically got the idea, spent some time kind of plotting out what might happen, thinking about the characters, and set into it. But then as I went along, if I needed to find out something, you know, then I would kind of research that particular point as I was moving along.
Yeah.
So some books don't require very much research, but if you're talking historical novels, which, you know,
Yeah.
I've done three in a row, New Under the Sun, Found Far and Wide, and then Land Beyond the Sea. So that all three together took a lot of research. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Very interesting. Yeah, I think that's most what I have to say. I just have one. I found one quote in one for the Rock that kind of struck me, given the times that we live in. And I just wanted to see how you react to that, because I know you didn't write that during this
Yeah.
whole inflation. But it is strange how people put in odd circumstances will open up their personal lives. So do you think that this period of isolation will result in kind of any good, maybe arts coming out or people opening up about their struggles that we don't even see?
Yeah,
How do you think, what do you think the result of that?
I do think that's probably going to be the case. Yeah, I mean, they do have this time to reflect and very little outside distraction. So it would seem to me that they're going to be looking inward a lot, and it's going to be a different world coming out of this. I mean, I can't see how it could be otherwise. And so I often think what people are going to make of it in terms of writings that will come from it. I mean, you may well get a rash of COVID-19 influenced books, scenarios, and so on. But I think you're going to get something which is perhaps much more interesting than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a reference I reading online the other day that Shakespeare wrote King Lear. You probably know this, while
Yeah.
being isolated for the plague.
Yeah.
So you need not have that high expectations that you're going to write your equivalent of King Lear. But yeah.
I saw people mocking that meme, and they're saying that literary agents are going to be deluged with people who have literally written King Lear and then are submitting it. So we'll see what happens.
See what happens. Yeah, but you know, one thing people don't have generally, unless they're in a necessary job, is they no longer say they don't have time to write. They always want, you know, people say, I always want to write, but I just don't have the time. Well, now is the butt up, or you know, keep quiet. This is the moment.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully something good will come of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to thank you for your time today. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you very much. It's
Yeah.
been fun.